Jungkook was used to getting what he wanted. A smile here, a wink there, and people melted at his feet. It wasn't arrogance, just experience. Professors, seniors, even some of his friends had fallen for his charm at some point. But there was one exception. Professor Kim Taehyung. Jungkook's infuriatingly cold, devastatingly handsome, and strictly off-limits art history professor. It had started as curiosity. Taehyung was young for a professor, yet he commanded every lecture hall like a king. His deep, rich voice could make the most boring topics sound like poetry, but it was his face that had Jungkook intrigued. Dark eyes framed by thick lashes, sharp jawline, full lips that looked too soft for someone so emotionally distant. He was a mystery Jungkook wanted to unravel. So, naturally, Jungkook had started flirting. A lingering gaze. A too casual touch when handing in assignments. A well-timed smirk whenever Taehyung caught him staring. Nothing worked. Taehyung barely even looked at him. No falter, no reaction, just the same unimpressed, detached expression. It was frustrating. And if there was one thing Jungkook hated, it was losing a game he didn't even know he was playing. Which was why, at this very moment, he was sitting at the back of Taehyung's lecture, arms crossed, lips slightly pursed, thinking about how to break that perfect composure. And then it happened. A slip, so small Jungkook almost missed it. Taehyung was handing out graded papers, his long fingers flipping through the stack effortlessly. Jungkook's name was called, and when he approached, their hands brushed for a fraction of a second. It was faint, but Jungkook swore he saw it, the slightest hesitation, a barely there pause in Taehyung's movements. His heart slammed against his ribs. Interesting. Taehyung wasn't completely unaffected. Jungkook smirked to himself as he returned to his seat, a new goal forming in his mind. This was no longer just about teasing his professor. Now, it was about breaking him. Jungkook liked a challenge. He thrived on it, craved it. The rush of making someone stumble, the satisfaction of watching their carefully built walls crack, it was a thrill he never got tired of. And Taehyung? He was the ultimate challenge. The next time they had class, Jungkook came prepared. He sat in the front row, his usual lazy slouch replaced with a posture that demanded attention. The top buttons of his white shirt were undone just enough to tease, a silver chain resting against his collarbones. He tapped his pen against his lip absently, staring straight at Taehyung as if he were the only person in the room. The lecture went on as usual, Taehyung speaking in that smooth, commanding voice, explaining brushstrokes and Renaissance artistry with effortless grace. But Jungkook didn't care about the lesson. He cared about the flicker of irritation that appeared when Taehyung noticed his stare. Jungkook smirked. Gotcha. Taehyung ignored him. He continued with his lecture, not giving Jungkook even a sliver of satisfaction. Fine. Two could play this game. When the class ended, students filed out, leaving only a few lingering to ask questions. Jungkook took his time packing up, waiting until the last person left. Then, he strolled up to Taehyung's desk. "Professor," he said smoothly, voice dipping into something dangerously close to flirtation. "I think I need some extra help." Taehyung didn't even look up. "You're at the top of the class, Jian. You don't need help," Jungkook grinned. "Maybe not academically." That got Taehyung's attention. Dark eyes flickered up, cool and unreadable. Jungkook leaned in, palms resting on the edge of the desk, bringing them just a little too close. You always look so serious, Professor. Don't you ever get tired of being so proper? Taehyung's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened. And you don't get tired of acting like a child? Jungkook's smirk faltered. Oh, that was a hit. But he recovered quickly, tilting his head, letting his hair fall slightly over his eyes. Maybe I just like testing limits. Taehyung set his pen down with an audible click. And what exactly do you think you're testing? Jungkook's pulse quickened. There was something in Taehyung's voice, something low, warning, dangerous. He swallowed but held his ground. I think you already know. A bit of silence. Then, Taehyung stood. Jungkook barely had time to react before Taehyung closed the distance between them, standing so close that Jungkook could smell his cologne. Woodsy, expensive, intoxicating. The shift in power was immediate. Taehyung leaned down slightly, voice dropping to a near whisper. You're playing a very foolish game, Jian. Jungkook exhaled slowly, willing his heart to stay steady. Maybe I like a little risk. Taehyung's lips twitched, not quite a smirk, not quite a frown. Then, just as quickly as he had stepped closer, Taehyung stepped back. Go home, Jungkook. Jungkook blinked. What? Taehyung returned to his desk, gathering his things. If you have time to waste on childish games, I assume you have enough time to complete next week's assignment ahead of schedule. Jungkook clenched his jaw. So that's it? You're just going to ignore me? Taehyung didn't answer. He simply picked up his bag, threw one last unreadable glance at Jungkook, and walked away, leaving Jungkook standing there, frustrated, confused, and more determined than ever. Jungkook was not the type to back down. If Taehyung thought he could brush him off with a few cold words, he had another thing coming. For the next week, Jungkook made it his mission to push harder. It started small. He stopped sitting in the back. Instead, he took the front seat, right in the center, where Taehyung had no choice but to see him. He made sure to look at Taehyung, really look, through every lecture, his gaze lingering just long enough to make it obvious. Then, he started showing up outside of class. Professor, Jungkook greeted casually, leaning against Taehyung's office door after class one evening. Taehyung barely glanced up from his papers. If this isn't academic related, leave, Jungkook smirked. Who says it's not academic? He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Taehyung finally looked at him. Jungkook. His voice was firm, but Jungkook didn't miss the slight tightness in his grip on his pen. You're walking a very thin line. Jungkook tilted his head, stepping closer. And yet, you haven't told me to stop. Taehyung's eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering behind them. But instead of reacting, he exhaled through his nose and set his pen down. What do you want? Jungkook took another step forward. Dinner. Taehyung blinked, clearly caught off guard. Excuse me, Jungkook grinned. Go to dinner with me. Taehyung's expression remained unreadable. You are my student? Jungkook shrugged. So? It's just dinner? He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Unless you're scared you'll like it. Silence. For a brief moment, Jungkook swore he saw it, hesitation. A crack in Taehyung's perfect composure. But then, just as quickly, Taehyung's face turned cold. I don't date students. Jungkook didn't falter. I didn't say anything about dating. Taehyung's jaw tensed. His hands curled slightly on the desk, and for the first time, Jungkook wondered, Was he pushing too far? But then, Taehyung stood. And instead of looking angry, he looked dangerous. Slowly, he walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Jungkook. Jungkook's heart pounded. Taehyung leaned in, voice dangerously low. Do you think this is a game? Jungkook swallowed, but he refused to back down. Maybe. Taehyung's gaze flickered over him, slow and deliberate. Then, with a small, almost mocking smirk, he said, "You're not ready for what you're asking for." Jungkook inhaled sharply. "Try me." Taehyung's smirk widened slightly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the door, opening it. "Go home, Jungkook." Jungkook clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Not even close. Jungkook wasn't done. Not even close. If Taehyung thought he could shut him down with a few cold words, he underestimated him. Over the next few weeks, Jungkook made it impossible for Taehyung to ignore him. It started with his presence. Jungkook was always there. In the front row of every lecture, his gaze never wavering, his expressions deliberately teasing. When Taehyung spoke, Jungkook let his lips part slightly, just enough to look distracted, to make it seem like he was paying attention to him and not the lesson. Then came the subtle touches. A brush of fingers when handing in a paper. A casual lean-in when asking a question. Just close enough that Taehyung could feel him there. But Jungkook wasn't reckless. He knew Taehyung was strong-willed. He knew pushing too hard might make him snap in the wrong way. So, instead, he made Taehyung come to him. One evening, as Taehyung was leaving his office, Jungkook was waiting by the door. "Long day?" Jungkook asked smoothly. Taehyung didn't even pause. "Go home, Jungkook." Jungkook grinned. "Buy me a coffee first." Taehyung stopped. Turned. His eyes were sharp. "Why would I do that?" Jungkook shrugged. "Because you're a good professor who wants his student to succeed." Taehyung exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "You're insufferable." Jungkook stepped closer. "And yet, you're still here." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, Taehyung walked away. But Jungkook didn't miss it. The way Taehyung's fingers curled at his sides, the way his shoulders were slightly tense. He was cracking. And Jungkook wasn't stopping now. Taehyung was losing control. It wasn't immediate. It was slow, so slow that he hadn't even noticed it happening at first. At first, Jungkook was just an annoyance. A bold, flirtatious student who needed to be put in his place. Taehyung had dealt with plenty of confident students before. He knew how to set boundaries. But Jungkook was different. He didn't back down. He didn't get embarrassed. He pushed. And worst of all, Taehyung wasn't unaffected. The first time Jungkook had leaned in too close, Taehyung had felt it. That sharp pull of attraction, the instinct to lean in just a little more. He had shut it down immediately. But it kept happening. Jungkook's eyes following him during lectures. The way he bit his lip when he was thinking. The casual way he stretched in class, his shirt riding up just enough to show a sliver of skin. Taehyung gritted his teeth, slamming his book shut. This was unacceptable. He was a professor. Jungkook was a student. That was the line. And yet, when Jungkook showed up outside his office again one evening, leaning against the wall with a lazy smirk, Taehyung's heart skipped a beat. "You should be at home," Taehyung said, voice firm. Jungkook grinned. "And you should stop pretending you don't like me." Taehyung inhaled sharply. "Jungkook, Jungkook stepped closer, eyes dark with something dangerous. What would happen, Professor, if I kissed you right now? Taehyung's pulse roared. For a brief second, he imagined it. Jungkook pressing him against the wall. Jungkook's lips, soft, warm, inviting. But Taehyung didn't let his expression falter. Instead, he exhaled slowly and said, voice like steel, you don't want to test me? Jungkook raised an eyebrow. Why not? Taehyung leaned in slightly, just enough to make Jungkook inhale sharply. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said, because if I ever give in, Jungkook, you won't able to handle it. Jungkook froze. And for the first time, just for a second, he looked unsure. Taehyung smirked. Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving Jungkook standing there, breathless, frustrated, and completely obsessed. Jungkook was losing his mind. Taehyung's words had been playing on repeat in his head for days. If I ever give in, Jungkook, you won't able to handle it. The way he had looked at Jungkook when he said it, the low rasp of his voice, it had done something dangerous to him. Jungkook had pushed. He had teased. He had done everything to get under Taehyung's skin. But he hadn't expected Taehyung to push back. And now, he was the one who couldn't stop thinking about it. The tension between them was unbearable. It crackled in the air whenever they were near each other, a silent battle neither of them acknowledged out loud. Jungkook needed to win. But now, it wasn't just about getting Taehyung into bed. It was about breaking the professor's perfect restraint. It was about making him lose control. And tonight, Jungkook was going to make sure it happened. That evening Taehyung didn't expect to see Jungkook outside his apartment door. For a second, he just stared. Jungkook looked different tonight. Not the playful, flirtatious student he had been in class. That night, he looked determined. What are you doing here? Taehyung finally asked, voice unreadable. Jungkook met his gaze, stepping forward. You said I wouldn't able to handle it. Taehyung exhaled sharply. Jungkook pushed him. Not physically, but with his presence, his unwavering gaze, the way he stepped so close that Taehyung could feel the heat of his body. And then, he reached out. Fingers curling gently in Taehyung's sleeve, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then prove it. Silence. Taehyung's jaw tightened. His breathing had gone slightly uneven, and for a second, just a second, his eyes darkened with something Jungkook had never seen before. Dangerous. Raw. Then, before Jungkook could react, Taehyung grabbed him. Jungkook barely had time to gasp before his back hit the door frame, Taehyung's hands on either side of him, trapping him in place. And the look in Taehyung's eyes, fuck. Low. Intense. Like he was done holding back. You really don't know what you're asking for, do you? Taehyung murmured. Jungkook swallowed, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then show me. Taehyung exhaled sharply through his nose, then, suddenly, laughed. It wasn't amused. It was dark. Frustrated. And then, kissed him. Jungkook barely had time to process it before he was being devoured. Taehyung wasn't soft. He wasn't hesitant. He kissed Jungkook like he was claiming him, like he had been starving for this. Jungkook owned, fingers fisting in Taehyung's shirt. This was nothing like he had imagined. It wasn't playful, it wasn't teasing. It was heat and frustration and weeks of tension snapping all at once. Taehyung pulled back just enough to murmur against his lips, voice husky, You wanted this. Jungkook barely had time to nod before Taehyung kissed him again. And this time, he wasn't stopping. Jungkook woke up to the feeling of warm fingers tracing lazy patterns on his back. He blinked blearily, body deliciously sore, before glancing up at the man beside him. Taehyung was awake. Bare chested, hair slightly messy, gazing at him with an expression Jungkook couldn't quite place. "Morning," Jungkook muttered, voice hoarse. Taehyung smirked slightly. "Still think you can handle me?" Jungkook groaned, hiding his face in the pillow. "Don't be cocky," Taehyung chuckled, fingers trailing down Jungkook's spine, making him shiver. "You started this," Taehyung murmured, pressing a kiss to his shoulder. "I just finished it," Jungkook huffed, but he couldn't fight the grin tugging at his lips. Maybe he had lost the game. But with the way Taehyung was looking at him now, like he wasn't letting him go anytime soon, it sure as hell didn't feel like losing. From the moment Jungkook set foot in his lecture hall, Taehyung had known he was trouble. It wasn't just his confidence. Plenty of students were bold. It wasn't even his flirting. Taehyung had been on the receiving end of playful advances before. He always shut them down, and they always moved on. But Jungkook didn't move on. He pushed. And the worst part? Taehyung felt it. At first, it had been easy to ignore. A lingering stare, a teasing smirk, a casual brush of fingers when handing in an assignment. But then Jungkook started getting deliberate. And that was when Taehyung started losing control. Jungkook would show up at his office unannounced. He would lean too close when asking questions, voice dropping just slightly, eyes flickering to Taehyung's lips like he knew. Like he knew exactly what he was doing to him. And it pissed Taehyung off. Because he wasn't weak. He had spent years perfecting his restraint, drawing firm boundaries between himself and his students. He wasn't the kind of man to fall for a challenge. But Jungkook wasn't a challenge. Jungkook was a goddamn temptation. And Taehyung had cracked the night Jungkook showed up outside his apartment door. Not just because he was there. Not just because he was persistent. But because of the way he looked at Taehyung. Gone was the playful student who always had a smug grin. Gone was the teasing glint in his eyes. That night, Jungkook looked serious. Determined. And when he murmured, "Then prove it," something inside Taehyung snapped. Because he had spent weeks pretending he didn't want this. Weeks convincing himself that Jungkook was just a reckless student looking for fun. But now, standing here, seeing the raw need in Jungkook's expression, Taehyung realized he had been wrong. Jungkook didn't just want a game. He wanted him. And Taehyung was done pretending he didn't want him back. So he grabbed Jungkook. Pinned him against the door frame. And when Jungkook's breath hitched, when his lips parted slightly, eyes blown wide with something like anticipation, Taehyung lost the last of his restraint. And he kissed him. Hard. Months of tension, weeks of holding back, it all poured into that. Jungkook against his lips, fingers fisting in Taehyung's shirt, and that sound, was nearly enough to drive Taehyung insane. Jungkook had asked him to prove it. So Taehyung was going to make sure he felt it. Felt how much Taehyung had been holding back. Felt just how dangerous it was to make him break. Because now that he had, there was no turning back. Taehyung had woken up first the next morning. Jungkook was sprawled out beside him, lips slightly swollen, hair a mess, his face soft in sleep. And for the first time in years, Taehyung felt at peace. He had spent so long thinking this was a mistake, that this was something he needed to avoid. But now, with Jungkook curled against him, still warm from the night before, Taehyung didn't regret a damn thing. Because he had tried to fight this. Tried to fight him. And he had lost. But for the first time, losing felt a lot like winning.